The blast came at the 9th hour, and Jun-mei felt it in her teeth before she heard it. She was 2 miles down the grade, kneeling in the cook tent over a kettle of rice congee, when the mountain coughed. The ground shuddered like a horse shaking off flies. The tin cups on their nails swung and rang. A fine gray dust sifted down from the canvas roof and settled on the backs of her hands, and she stayed there on her knees a long moment, not breathing, the ladle gone still in the pot. Blasting was ordinary here. The Central Pacific fed the Sierra black powder the way a man feeds a fire, and the crews had learned to eat and sleep through the thud of it. But this thud had come wrong. Too deep, too long. It had rolled instead of cracked, and rolling was the sound of a face coming down when it should not. Her father was on that face today. Baba, with his crooked back and his patient hands, tamping powder into the granite above the cape. She was on her feet before she knew she had risen. She left the congee to burn. The men were already running when she came out of the tent into the hard white light, running up the grade toward a boiling column of dust the color of old bone, and Jun-mei ran with them, her cloth shoes slipping on the loose ballast, her long braid whipping against her spine. Somewhere a bell was clanging. A white foreman on a gray horse shouted words she could not catch. The dust ahead did not settle. It hung against the pines like a ghost that had forgotten how to leave, and beneath it, when she was close enough, she saw the tumbled black shale where a clean-cut ledge had been that morning, and she saw the men digging into it with their bare hands, and she stopped running. Because a woman knows, she knows the way the living stand around the dead. They would not let her through. 2 men she had cooked for 100 times caught her by the arms and held her at the edge of the rubble, while others dug, and she did not scream, because screaming was for women who still hoped. She had crossed an ocean in the dark hold of a ship to come to this man. She had sewn his torn quilted coat by lantern light not 3 nights past, her needle catching the fabric, his snores the only lullaby she had left in the world. She stood very still between the 2 men's hands, and she watched them lift what the mountain had given back, and her knees did not buckle, and her face did not break, and only her right fist closed hard around the jade at her throat, until the cool green stone bit a small crescent into her palm. That was the first day, the day the mountain took her father, and the company took his name. By evening they had a story, and the story was written before his body was cold. Jun-mei stood at the edge of the pine torches and listened to the pale men decide it among themselves. A misfired charge, they agreed. Careless tamping by the Chinese crew. The China boys did not respect the powder, everyone knew that, jabbering in their heathen tongue instead of minding the fuse. A tragedy, yes, but the company was not to blame, and no wage would be docked from any white man's pay, and the widow, they glanced at her, the girl in the dust-gray tunic with the strange still eyes. The daughter, then, could be sent down to the coast on the next supply wagon and be no further trouble to anyone. She understood more English than they credited her with. She had learned it the way she learned everything, silently, watchfully, from the underside. And so she heard them hang her father with their words, and she felt something in her chest turn from grief into a harder thing, a cold, clean thing like the jade at her throat, and she lifted her eyes and found the one man who had not spoken. He stood apart from the others, near the black horse, and he was looking at the covered shape on the ground and not at the men deciding its meaning. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, his face burned dark under a sweat-stained hat, a foreman's authority in the set of him, and something else too, something that did not fit the easy verdict the others were passing around like a bottle. His jaw was working, his hand kept opening and closing at his side, and when the others laughed at some small grim joke to loosen the horror of the day, he did not laugh. He turned his head away as if the sound hurt him. Samuel Reed. She learned his name that night from the other cooks. The foreman of the whole upper grade. The man whose word decided which crew worked which face, which charge was set where, which men went up the mountain in the morning. If her father had died by any man's order, he had died by this one's. She should have hated him first of all. Instead, she watched him walk away into the dark alone, his shoulders bowed like a man carrying something no one had handed him, and she wondered, with the cold, clear part of her that grief had opened, why a guilty man walks like that. He did not send her down the mountain. The supply wagon came and went 3 days later, and Jun-mei was not on it. She stayed in the cook tent because no one had the heart or the authority to make her go, and she cooked because her hands needed something to hold, and she waited, though she could not have said for what. On the 4th night, she found her answer folded under the rice sack where she kept her father's things. Money. American paper money, more than her father had earned in 2 months, weighted down with a river stone. No note was needed. She knew the hand of guilt when she held it, the same way she had known the way the living stand around the dead. She did not spend it. She put it inside her father's tobacco tin and she closed the lid, and the next morning she walked up the grade in the gray cold before the whistle blew, past the sleeping tents, to where the foreman kept his own small shelter apart from the men, and she waited outside it until he came out pulling his suspenders over his shoulders, and stopped dead at the sight of her. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The mountain was blue and enormous behind him. Somewhere down the grade a mule brayed. "I don't want your money," she said in English, and her voice did not shake. "I want the truth of how my father died." She saw it land on him. She saw the color go out from under the burn of his face, saw the small flinch at the corner of his eye, and she knew then, with a certainty that frightened her, that the easy verdict at the torches had been a lie, and that this man knew it was a lie, and that it was eating him alive. "Go back down to the coast," he said, low and rough. "There's nothing for you here but hard men and hard weather." "My father is here," she answered. "In the ground you told them was his fault." His hand rose halfway to his hat and dropped. He looked at her the way a man looks at a wound he cannot stop bleeding, and he turned and walked up the grade to his day's work without another word. And Jun-mei stood there in the cold and watched him go, and understood that she had lodged herself in him like a splinter that would not work its way out. He took her in that same week, and the whole camp talked. It was not what the talk supposed. There was a widow woman, Mrs. Alderdice, who kept the paymaster's boarding shack down at the railhead, and Reed arranged and paid for Jun-mei to have a bed and board there, in exchange for cooking and washing, and if any man made a joke of it in his hearing, the joke died in that man's throat under the flat look Reed gave him. He did not touch her. He barely spoke to her. But he had put a roof between her and the wagon that would have swept her out of his sight forever, and Jun-mei understood that a man who cannot say a thing will sometimes build it instead. The boarding shack sat where the Chinese camp met the white one, and so she lived in the seam between two worlds, welcome fully in neither. The white boarders would not take rice from her hand without wiping the bowl. The Chinese crews, proud men from her own province of Guangdong, looked at the girl who ate under a white foreman's protection and did not know whether to pity her or spit. She learned to move through both with her eyes lowered and her spine straight, and every night she took her father's jade pendant from around her neck and held it to the lantern and studied the small carved characters on its back. Long life, good fortune, that her mother had pressed into her father's hand at the dock in Canton, the last thing of the family that had crossed the sea whole. She began, without meaning to watch Samuel Reed. She watched him the way she had learned to watch everything, from the underside, from the edges, from the cook line and the wash trough. She saw a hard man, feared by the crews, who nonetheless walked the whole grade each dusk after the others had eaten, checking the day's charges with a lantern, his lips moving as if he were counting or praying. She saw him crouch one afternoon beside a Chinese laborer whose hand had been crushed and set the man's fingers himself, gently, cursing the company doctor, who would not come up the mountain for a China boy. She saw him drunk exactly once, on the anniversary of some private grief, sitting alone on a powder crate staring down into the canyon, and she heard him say a woman's name that was not her own, Ellen, and heard the way his voice broke on it, and she carried that name away with her like a stone in her shoe. And she saw, again and again, that he could not look at the cape where her father had died. He routed the crews around it. He would not set a charge within 100 yards of it. The others thought it was superstition. Jun-mei knew better. It was the place where the lie lived, and the lie was too heavy to walk past. One evening she brought his supper up herself because the boy who usually carried it had taken fever, and she found him bent over a leather-bound ledger in his shelter, the lantern low, his big shoulders hunched, and he did not hear her at the flap. She saw the columns of the ledger before he snapped it shut. Dates. Charge weights. The word defective written and underlined 3 times beside a shipment number, in his own cramped hand, weeks before her father's death. He looked up and caught her looking. Something passed between them in the lantern light, quick and terrible, and for the length of one held breath she thought he would finally speak the thing he was carrying. Instead he said, "Horse. Set it down and go." She set the bowl down, but at the flap she stopped, and without turning, she said the only thing that would not stay behind her teeth. "My father tamped that charge with his own hands. He was the most careful man I ever knew." He counted the fuse 3 times, every time, because his own father died young and left him nothing but caution. She heard him breathe. He did not kill himself with carelessness, Mr. Reed. Something else killed him, and you know its name. She walked back down to the boarding shack in the dark, and behind her, the lantern in the foreman's shelter burned all night and did not go out. The truth came apart slowly, the way frozen ground gives up a buried thing only when the season finally turns. She found the first thread in the paymaster's shack, where the ledgers of the whole works were kept in a locked chest, and where Mrs. Alderdice, half-blind and fond of Jun-mei's quiet company, dozed through the long afternoons. Jun-mei read English slowly, but she read it. And while she scrubbed the floor, she read the shipping manifests stacked on the paymaster's desk, and she found what Reed had underlined. Black powder from a supplier called Deacons & Co., purchased cheap by a company agent named Horace Vance, the same Vance who oversaw the accounts of the upper grade, the same Vance who had smiled at the torches and named her father careless. The powder had come damp and unstable. Deacons & Co. had sold it as first grade and charged first grade prices, and Vance had approved the payment and pocketed, she understood at last, the difference between what the company paid and what the bad powder was worth. Damp powder does not burn even. It sits sullen in the drill hole, while a careful man counts a fuse he can trust, and then it wakes wrong, too slow or too sudden, and it kills the careful man precisely because he trusted it. Her father had not been careless. Her father had been sold. She understood then why Samuel Reed could not sleep. He had warned them. Defective, underlined 3 times, weeks before. He had written it in his ledger and carried it to Vance and been told to keep the crews moving. That the schedule would not wait for a foreman's nerves, that a shipment already paid for would by God be used. And Reed, who needed the work, who answered to Vance, who had a grief of his own already bending his back, had let the crews go up the mountain on powder he did not trust. He had gambled other men's lives against his own livelihood, and he had lost her father, and he had stood at the torches and heard a dead man blamed for his own murder and said nothing, because the truth would cost him everything, and the lie would cost him only his sleep. She should have gone to the others. She had proof enough to hang Vance in the court of the crews, if not the court of the law. But she was a Chinese woman on a mountain full of men who would not take rice from her hand. And she knew the way the world weighed her word against a white agent's. And she knew, too, a colder thing, that if she brought the lie down, she would bring Samuel Reed down under it. And somewhere in the long nights of watching him she had stopped wanting that. That was the frightening part. That was the thing she held to the lantern along with the jade and could not carve any characters onto. She did not want to destroy the man who had let her father die. Winter closed the high grade and drove the whole works down to the railhead, and in the crush of the lower camp there was suddenly no hiding from him. He came to the boarding shack now on the plain excuse of the ledgers, and stayed on no excuse at all. He would sit at Mrs. Alderdice's plank table while Jun-mei kneaded dough, and he would say nothing for an hour, and the nothing was full. She taught him, without either of them naming it a lesson, the words on her jade pendant. Long life, good fortune. He turned the little stone over in his big scarred fingers with a care that undid her, and he said the Cantonese words back to her clumsily, and she did not laugh, and the lantern hissed, and outside the snow came down over the buried rails. He told her about Ellen on the second such night, in the flat voice men use for the wounds that have not healed. His wife, dead of the fever 3 winters back, in a sod house in Nebraska, while he was 200 miles west, chasing rail work to pay the doctor, who came too late anyway. He had buried her alone in the frozen ground, with a borrowed spade, and he had not stopped moving since, west and west, because a moving man does not have to lie down at night in a bed that is half empty. He had come to the Sierra to disappear into the biggest work there was, and instead, he had found himself the foreman of other men's lives, and he had let one of those lives go up the mountain on bad powder. And now there was a girl in a gray tunic living in his ledgers who would not let him disappear at all. He did not say all of that. He said perhaps 1/5 of it. But Jun-mei had learned to read the 4/5 of a man that stays behind his teeth, and she read it, and her hand went still in the dough. And when he finally looked up at her, his eyes were not the eyes of a foreman. "I should have told you at the start," he said, "about the powder, what I knew." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "Why haven't you gone to the others?" She looked at him a long time. The snow ticked against the oiled paper of the window. "Because I have already lost one man I love to this mountain," she said, before she could stop the word. "And I did not want to bury another." He went very still. She heard him breathe. And then his hand crossed the plank table and closed over her flower-white one, slow, giving her every moment to draw it away. And she did not draw it away. And the two of them sat in the lantern light with their hands together over the dough while the snow buried the west outside. Two people from two worlds the frontier swore must never touching. Then the door banged open on the wind, and Horace Vance stood in it with snow on his shoulders and a smile on his face like a crack in ice. He had seen, or he had guessed. It did not matter which. Vance was a man who collected the secrets of others the way he collected the difference on bad powder, and he had come down through the storm because he had smelled a thing he could use. He looked at the foreman's hand over the Chinese girl's hand, and his smile widened, and Jun-mei felt Samuel Reed turn to stone beside her. "Cozy," Vance said. He shut the door behind him and stamped the snow from his boots, unhurried, a man who owned the room he stood in. "The company would be interested, Reed. A foreman keeping a China girl. There's talk enough already. Wouldn't take much to make it the kind of talk that ends a man's contract." He warmed his hands at the stove as if he had all winter. "But I'm a reasonable man. I don't care where you put your hands of an evening. I care that the upper grade comes in on schedule and that certain ledgers stay shut. You keep minding your fuses and forgetting your arithmetic, and I'll keep forgetting what I saw tonight. We understand each other." Jun-mei watched Samuel Reed's jaw work under the dark burn of his face, watched the old bend come back into his shoulders, the disappearing man, the man who needed the work, and she understood that Vance had just found the exact seam of him and set his charge in it. One word from Vance and Reed was finished. No contract, no wage, a ruined name, and the girl he had sheltered thrown to the wagon, and the weather after all. She felt the whole fragile roof he had built between her and the world begin to tilt. And she understood something else, watching the two men. Vance was not afraid of Reed. Vance was afraid of the ledger. He had come down through a blizzard not to threaten a foreman's romance, but to reseal a foreman's silence, which meant the arithmetic still mattered, which meant it could still be made to speak. She lowered her eyes and kept them lowered, the girl in the corner, beneath notice, and while the men measured each other, she did what she had done her whole life on the underside of the powerful world. She listened. She counted. She remembered the number of the shipment and the name of Deacon Zico, and the 3 underlinings in Reed's own hand, and she began, quietly, in the corner of a snowed-in shack, to plan. The company came up to the high grade in spring to open the great cut through the summit, and with them came a company man from Sacramento, an inspector, a proper one, sent because the works were behind, and the directors wanted to know where their black powder and their money had gone. Jun-mei had waited all winter for exactly this. A man from outside. A man Vance did not own. She could not walk up to a company inspector and be believed. She knew the arithmetic of her own word too well, but she had spent the winter learning where every thread lay, and she had one thing no one else had thought to keep. When they had cleared the rubble from the cape the autumn before, she had gone up alone in the gray dawns while the camp slept, and she had sifted the black shale with her hands, the way a mother sifts ash, and she had found what a careful sifting finds, the ruptured tin of the charge canister her father had packed, its seams blown, and inside the seam a residue that was not the fine dry grain of good powder, but a caked and sweated crust, the signature of powder that had gone damp in the keg. She had wrapped it in her father's tobacco tin. She had kept it through the whole winter next to the untouched gilt money and the jade. She did not take it to the inspector. She took it to Samuel Reed. She found him at dusk on the lip of the summit cut, alone, doing the thing he always did, walking the day's charges with his lantern, and she put the tobacco tin into his hands and opened it, and she watched him understand. She watched the foreman look at the proof of the thing he had known and hidden, held out to him by the daughter of the man it had killed. She watched him understand that she was giving it to him instead of to the inspector, that she was giving him the choice she had never had. "You can go to Vance," she said quietly, "and keep your silence, and keep your contract, and I will take my father's tin and go down to the coast, and you will never see me again, and no one will ever know. Or you can carry that tin to the inspector yourself, in your own hand, with your own ledger beside it, and tell the truth of how a careful man died. It will cost you everything the company can take. It will not cost you me." The wind pulled at her braid. Below them, the whole works glittered with cook fires in the blue dark. "My father counted his fuse 3 times because he was afraid. I'm asking you to count it only once, and light it." He stood a long time with the tin in his hands, and the mountain going dark around them, and Jun-mei did not push him further, because she had learned that a man who cannot say a thing will sometimes do it if you only stop building the wall in front of him. And then Samuel Reed closed the tin, and looked at her, and said the first tender word he had ever said to her, low and rough, and in his clumsy Cantonese, the word on her jade pendant, the word for good fortune. And he turned and walked down the grade toward the inspector's tent with the lantern swinging in his fist. And he did not walk like a man carrying something anymore. He walked like a man who had finally set it down. It cost him nearly everything, as she had promised it would. Vance did not go quietly. There was a reckoning in the inspector's tent that lasted till the small hours, the 2 men's voices carrying across the sleeping camp, and there was a morning when it might have gone either way, when Vance stood before the Sacramento man and named Samuel Reed a drunk and a liar besotted with a China girl who would say anything, and the whole verdict of a year hung again on whose word a company chose to weigh. But Reed had the ledger, defective underlined 3 times in his own hand and dated weeks before the blast, and he had the tin, the caked and sweated crust that any powderman could read. And when the inspector, unconvinced, said that residue proved nothing and a China girl's tin proved less, Samuel Reed did the thing that finally turned it. He walked the inspector up to the cape that Reed himself had refused to touch for a year, and he set a small test charge of the same Deacon's powder still crated in the company stores, and he lit it before the man's eyes, and it burned sullen and slow and wrong, exactly as she had said it would, and it blew late and it blew ugly, and the inspector from Sacramento stood in the drifting smoke with all the color gone out of his face, and understood that a careful man had been murdered by a number in a ledger. Vance ran before they could bring the law up the mountain. He took a horse in the night and went east into the high passes, and the frontier swallowed him, and Jun-mei found she did not need to see him hang. The lie was dead. That was enough. Her father's name came off the accident book of the Central Pacific and went into the record clean. A careful man killed by defective powder, no fault of the crew, and it was a small thing on a piece of company paper, and it was everything in the world. But it took Reed's contract with it, as such truths do. The company did not thank a foreman who cost them a supplier, an agent, and a season's schedule to satisfy his conscience over one dead Chinese laborer. They paid him off short and let him go, and the crews who had feared him lined the grade in the gray morning as he saddled the black horse. And one by one, the Chinese laborers of Guangdong, the men who would not take rice from her hand, took off their wide hats to the white foreman who had hanged his own career to clear one of their own. Jun-mei stood at the head of them with her jade at her throat and watched the hardest men on the mountain honor the softest thing a hard man had ever done. He came to her before he mounted. The whole camp watched, and neither of them cared. "I've no contract now," he said. "No wage. A ruined name with every railroad from here to the Missouri." He turned his hat in his hands. "I've nothing to offer a woman but a horse and a hard road, and whatever work a disgraced foreman can find. I crossed an ocean with less," Jun-mei said. "I let your father die. You told the truth that raised him from a liar's grave." She stepped close, into the shadow of the black horse, and she took his big scarred hand and turned it over, and pressed her father's jade pendant into the palm, and closed his fingers on it. "He would not want me to bury another man on this mountain, Mr. Reed. He would want me to leave it, with you." She saw the thing break open in his face that had been sealed since a sod house in Nebraska. She saw the moving man decide, at last, to lie down somewhere. And in front of the whole works, the crews and the cooks and the pale borders and the wide indifferent sky, Samuel Reed bent his weathered head to the Chinese girl from Guangdong and kissed her, and the men of two worlds who had sworn it must never happen watched it happen, and the mountain that had taken so much gave that one thing back. They went down out of the Sierra together as the snow let go of the passes. There was no ranch waiting, no fortune, nothing but the horse and the hard road he had promised. But Jun-mei had never in her life been promised a soft one, and she found that a hard road walked beside the right man is a different country than a soft one walked alone. They came at last to a small, dusty town on the Sacramento River, where the railroad had already passed through and left its usual wake of the hopeful and the stranded. And there was a Chinatown of two crooked streets, red paper lanterns strung between the laundry and the herb shop, and there was work for a man who could build and manage. And there was a shuttered storefront going cheap because its owner had died in the diggings. They opened it together. A supply store on the White Street with a herbalist's counter along the back wall on the Chinatown side, so that it faced both ways at once, the way she had learned to live. Reed kept the ledgers, honest to the penny, and Jun-mei ground her mother's remedies in a stone mortar behind the counter and sold them to Chinese laborers and, in time, to white women too who came in the back way at dusk, when nothing the American doctor gave them had helped. The town talked, at first. The town always talks. And then the town got used to it, the way towns do. And then the town could not remember when the Reeds had not been there, and a thing that had been forbidden became a thing that was simply true. A red lantern went up over the door the first autumn, and another the next. And children came, 2 of them, a boy with his father's shoulders, and a girl with her mother's still watchful eyes. And they grew up speaking 2 tongues and belonging, unlike their mother, fully to both worlds at once. Over the counter, on a small shelf where the herbalist's scales were kept, stood 2 things side by side, her father's tobacco tin, empty now, and her father's ancestor tablet, and Samuel Reed learned to bow to it on the feast days, clumsily, the way he had learned the words on the jade, and Jun-mei never once laughed at him, and always loved him more for the trying. He gave her back the jade pendant on their first anniversary, restrung on a new silk cord, and told her he had only been keeping it warm. She wore it every day after, until it was worn smooth as river glass. Long life, good fortune, the last whole thing that had crossed the sea from Canton, warm now against the pulse of a woman who had made a whole life in the country that took her father. Many years on, when the railroad they had both bled for was an old thing rusting into the grass and the 2 of them were gray, Jun-mei sat one evening on the porch of the store with her husband, while the last light went gold over the river, and she took the jade from around her neck and closed his old scarred hand around it, the way she had at the foot of the black horse a lifetime before. He turned it over in his fingers and read the worn characters he could read now, without her help, and he said the Cantonese words softly, and got them right at last, and neither of them needed to say anything more. I've wondered, telling you this by the fire tonight, what it takes for 2 people the whole world has decided must never meet to reach across all of it and hold on anyway. A jade stone, a ledger, a truth too heavy to keep, a hand that finally crosses a plank table in the snow. If you had been Jun-mei, standing at those pine torches while they hanged your father with a lie, could you have found it in you to spare the man who let it happen? And would that mercy have been weakness, or the bravest thing you ever did? I would truly love to hear what you think. So tell me down in the comments, and if this story warmed something in you tonight, stay a while by this fire with me, subscribe, and let me tell you another.